I am a lawyer, but I am not necessarily your lawyer. The materials discussed in this podcast are for informational purposes only and should not be deemed legal advice. If you have a specific legal question according to your circumstances, then I encourage you to speak with an attorney licensed in your jurisdiction. Welcome back to another edition of Ag Law Today. We've got Jesse Haskins back in the house, all the way from Tampa, Florida. Jesse, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you.
So Jesse, tell our listeners a little bit more about you, your law practice, and the different segments of the food and agriculture industry that you presently serve.
I started my firm, Jesse Haskins Law, to dedicate to all the local community food systems. That includes everything from growers, ranchers, beekeepers, and all the organizations such as farmers markets, compost organizations, and nonprofits that help them. And I've decided to dedicate my practice to this area because I do consider myself an avid foodie. And as I became more enthusiastic about eating, I started to wonder more about what is behind the deliciousness. So I read books, popular books like Michael Pollan's Omnivore's Dilemma. And from there, I became very interested in the policy and the legal aspects.
I like that you mentioned beekeeping. I have some apiary dreams here on Carrie's farm. So anyway, I'm looking forward to our conversation today on conservation easements. Jesse, can you tell me a little bit more about agriculture conservation easements and how do they differ from and like an easement that I might have with my neighbor because I use their driveway every day?
They legally have similar roots that go back to essentially England before the existence of the US. But the key difference of agricultural conservation easements is that this is a modern specific response to the land tenure and the crisis of the availability of agricultural land. Unfortunately, the same qualities that make prime farmland so attractive for farmers, the nutrients, the deep soil, the gradual sloping, that also makes it a target for developers who are interested in using the same land, purchasing the same land for non-farm uses. And what an agricultural conservation easement does is it helps farmers, ranchers who want to preserve their farmland, but at the same time, they may be feeling a financial pinch. So the arrangement is that the farmer, the grower, the rancher gets at least the opportunity to get some cash in exchange for selling their right to develop the land or their right to sell the land to developers who would convert it to non-farm uses. So even after the sale, the grower is still the owner of the land, and they can still use it to earn a livelihood, to grow, to profit from the land. But there are going to be restrictions in what they do. And those restrictions are going to be enforced by the person who bought, or the entity rather, that bought that agricultural conservation easement, either a nonprofit organization or a government agency.
So Jesse, this is perhaps a kind of like an elementary analogy, but I'm just going to go with it. So I know that some people sometimes talk about property rights being a bundle of sticks. So in that analogy, then basically basically the farmer, rancher, landowner is essentially still selling one of his sticks, which is the ability to basically sell to a developer, right?
Yes.
Okay. In the same way that a farmer rancher could sell another stick, which might be their wind rights to that property.
Yes, and they're also selling the right to for their heirs or whoever they sell it to is going to be restricted as well.
So how long does that restriction last? For perpetuity?
It it should, in order to get maximum, especially if the landowner wants potential tax benefits, it would need to be in perpetuity. But that is really dictated by state law. Most states do allow for these permanent agricultural conservation easements. There is one exception. North Dakota is the only state that does not recognize the agricultural conservation easement.
So do these conservation easements have restrictions as far as like the number of livestock that they could run on a particular parcel of land and, irrigation measures, et cetera? Like how restrictive are the conservation easements?
It can be as restrictive or not restrictive as state law and the farmer and the conservation easement holder allow. So there could be cases, especially if let's say the landowner really wants to protect it from development and just wants it to, be essentially a grow diverse crops. There could be language in there that doesn't allow any animals. But there's an interaction between federal law, especially when we're talking about tax benefits and potential estate planning consequences, and state law, which really defines what an agricultural conservation easement is.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Because there's all these different fields of laws, different levels, different jurisdictions with federal law and state law interacting, it is important to consult with a lawyer in terms of exactly what can and cannot be done, depending on the purpose that the landowner is trying to achieve.
So you're telling me that agriculture conservation easements are basically a mechanism derived from state law and federal law, or is it more of a state by state?
It's more of a state by state. There is a number of states that have adopted a uniform law that defines what an agricultural conservation easement is, but it still starts at the state level. Where the federal government gets involved is where you're talking about tax benefits, and if you are trying to get, the federal government is a major source of funding as far as actually getting these agricultural conservation easements paid for. So if you want funding from the federal government, then you have to follow federal requirements.
So where does the money come from to pay the landowner? Is this coming from taxpayer dollars? Is it coming from non-governmental organizations? Where is it coming from?
It's coming from both, and from states often provide their own funds and tax benefits as well. American Farmland Trust is a national nonprofit organization, for example, that provides funds. On the federal government level, there are three major programs for funds. The first is the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program run by NRCS. There's also a regional partner program also run by NRCS. The third I find very interesting because this is run by the Department of Defense, the Readiness and Environmental Protection Integration. And the premise behind this is that the military is concerned if all this land around its bases is getting developed, wildlife
Mm.
isn't going to really have a place to go. Wildlife could wander into these military bases and interfere with training exercises and with missions. So the Department of Defense is also a significant source of funding for agricultural conservation
Oh,
easements.
wow, I never even thought about that. Such an interesting issue here. So, Jesse, how exactly does this work? If I'm a farmer in, let's say, Indiana, and I'm interested in having an agriculture conservation easement, I don't know if it's right for me and my family, but I just want to explore it. Who do I reach out to?
The you you can find a good place to start would probably be with the nonprofit organizations. As I mentioned, American Farmland Trust is one of them. There are several others as well that operate both on national levels and on state levels. So that would be a good place to start. Some of the federal programs, the largest, the ACEP, actually gives funds directly to those trusts. So it's difficult to deal, especially if you're talking about getting that main pot of fund to deal with the federal government directly. Uh,
And once they reach out, then what is the process? Is it that every landowner who's interested is in, or do they have to apply? Does somebody make a farm visit? Do they look on the internet and see how close they are to development? What's sort of the next step after that initial contact?
they would have to apply, and that application process would vary from land trust to land trust, but they do have an obligation to visit even after that agricultural conservation easement is executed. The best practice for them is to actually visit every year. So this is an ongoing process. They are going to make, and they should make that initial site visit to make sure that everything is good. But it starts with a discussion with the land trust, and it's also important to make sure that the land trust has compatible objectives, because some land trusts may be more restrictive. Others may not be restrictive enough. If the aim of the grower is to actually, there's different ideas of what agricultural conservation and land preservation mean, and I think there's a lot of a legitimate discussion and room for disagreement. But in finding a land trust, it's important to make sure that the two parties have a similar appreciation for one
So are the terms negotiable? I mean, what role do you see as a lawyer who's helping clients navigate the agriculture conservation easement program?
another. I want to make sure that their interests and concerns are reflected. There's a lot of activity, for example, that a land trust may consider development that the landowner may consider part of the legacy of the farm. If you're talking about something like a bed and breakfast or wanting to build a farm stand in the future, technically that could be development. And it's important to make sure that all of those concerns are addressed up front. A lot of times the land trust would probably be willing to work with the farm, but it's important to really flesh out exactly what the details of these restrictions on development are.
And Jesse, to close our conversation, we have listeners from coast to coast, and I know that you're down there on the Gulf Coast, right? But where can our listeners find an agriculture lawyer to best fit their legal needs, whatever that is? What's your advice to help our listeners find an agriculture attorney near them?
There are two national groups. The Agriculture Lawyers Association and the American Bar Association also has an ad management committee. And those are probably good resources as far as locating attorneys. Of course, Google and other just internet research would help as well if there's a particular issue as far as internet research. But as far as getting referrals, if you want to reach out to organizations, those are really the top two that are dedicated to agriculture law.
Yeah, absolutely. The American Agriculture Law Association, AALA, is definitely a great resource. There's some talk for the conference. I don't know if you know this, Jesse, but the conference for the fall might turn into be a virtual conference. But nonetheless, there's a nice little membership directory there to help our listeners find an agriculture lawyer near them. And then in addition, the American Bar Association has various agriculture law committees. The General Practice Solo and Small Firm section has an agriculture law committee that I used to chair. And so that membership role is certainly a nice Rolodex of ag lawyers. Jesse, how can people contact you if they're interested in having some follow-up conversation regarding agriculture conservation easements, or perhaps they want to reach out on other issues?
Yes, my website is jhaskinslaw.com. They can also call me directly at 919-667-4689. That's my personal number. It'll go straight to me. And finally, my email is Jesse, Jesse, @jhaskinslaw.com.
And I wanted to note to our listeners that Jesse is a prolific writer. You've got quite the food and ag law blog there. Is that right?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I would definitely go check that out. So Jesse, thanks again for coming back to the podcast. I enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you for having me.